The morning air was cool against my skin when I opened the door, but the sight waiting on my porch cut through me like heat. Hannah stood there after more than a decade, her eyes scanning my face as if searching for a version of me she could still use. Behind her, suitcases crowded the doorway, and Evan hovered with the tense posture of someone who already expected something from me. If you've ever felt the ground shift beneath you before a single word was spoken, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Moments like this have a way of changing everything. In that instant, I felt the past pressing against the present, warning me that this wasn't a homecoming. It was an arrival with purpose. And that was the moment everything started to unravel. I still remember the way the morning light fell across my living room when everything in my life shifted. It happened the moment I opened my front door and saw my daughter, Hannah, standing on my porch in Asheville after more than 10 years of silence. The shock hit me so sharply that it felt like my breath forgot how to move, and before I could even process the fact that she was really there, my eyes caught the rest of the scene. Her partner, Evan, standing just behind her, and the luggage piled around them as if they weren't visiting, but arriving with expectations I hadn't been warned about. Something in me tightened immediately. There was no soft reunion energy, no hesitant smile that hinted at longing or regret. Instead, there was a careful steadiness in the way she held herself, almost like someone stepping into a space they had already decided belonged to them. I felt myself taking in every detail because my intuition was already whispering that this moment wasn't about love or healing. It was something else, something heavier. As they stood there, framed by the doorway of the home I built without them, old memories flickered like unwelcome echoes. The distance, the silence, the unanswered calls, all of it pressed forward at once. And even before either of us spoke, I knew this was only the beginning of a story I never expected to tell. There was a time when I believed the distance between Hannah and me would close on its own, the way small fractures sometimes heal without anyone noticing. But ours didn't heal. It widened quietly, year after year, until I could no longer pretend it was temporary. It began with little misunderstandings, moments when she pulled away, and I convinced myself she simply needed space. I remember standing in the kitchen on nights when she came home later and later, feeling the silence stretch between us like something living. I kept trying to reach for her, but it felt as though every attempt slipped through my hands. When she left for college, I told myself it was natural for kids to grow independent. But the calls grew shorter, then infrequent, then gone. I replayed the past so many times, trying to understand what I missed, what I failed to give her, where I could have turned differently. Guilt became a quiet shadow I carried everywhere. Still, life has a way of pushing you forward even when your heart remains stuck. I learned to build new routines, fill empty evenings with work, long walks, small rituals that reminded me I was still here. Slowly, a steadier version of myself emerged, one who could breathe without waiting for the phone to ring. Years later, when a modest inheritance came unexpectedly, it lifted the financial strain I had lived with for so long. It didn't change my life dramatically, but it gave me stability I had never known. And even though no one said it out loud, I knew word of it traveled through the family circles. So when Hannah appeared at my door after all those years, something inside me stirred beneath the shock. A quiet intuition rose to the surface, whispering that her return wasn't shaped solely by longing or reconciliation. It felt tied to something else, something weightier, and I couldn't shake the sense that the timing was anything but accidental. There was a strange energy in the house the moment Hannah and Evan stepped inside. Something I felt before I fully understood it. Instead of taking in the space with familiarity or warmth, their eyes moved across the rooms the way people scan a place they're evaluating. I watched them drift from the living room to the kitchen, their gazes lingering not on the memories held within the space, but on the objects themselves, as though they were confirming details they had already discussed privately. The air felt tight, stretched thin by everything unspoken. As they moved around, I felt myself slipping into old habits, the ones I worked so hard to outgrow. I caught myself wanting to fill every silence, wanting to explain why I bought certain things, or why the house looked different now. It was an old instinct, that ache to prove I was enough, that urge to make them comfortable, even if it cost me pieces of myself. But beneath those impulses, another voice quietly pushed back, reminding me I wasn't the same woman I had been when they left my life. Their expressions carried a polished heaviness, the kind people wear when they've rehearsed a story they plan to tell. They mentioned how overwhelming the past few years had been, how life had stacked itself against them in ways they never anticipated. There was a practiced quality to the way they carried their exhaustion, as though preparing me for something without yet naming it. Every small sigh, every exchanged glance between them, felt intentional, designed to plant seeds without committing to the truth. By the time we finally settled into the living room, my unease had settled into something firmer. A subtle certainty began forming in the quiet spaces between us. Whatever brought them back after all these years wasn't rooted in love or reconciliation. Something else was coming, and I could feel it gathering just beyond the edges of the conversation. It happened slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, the way a storm announces itself with a single shift in the wind. One moment, we were sitting together in my living room, suspended in uneasy small talk, and the next, I felt something in their demeanor change. Their comments grew heavier, their expressions more strained, as if they were circling the edge of a confession they didn't know how to deliver cleanly. I watched their eyes drift toward the floor, toward each other, anywhere but toward me. And I knew they were preparing to reveal whatever had dragged them back into my life after so many years. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't arrive as a clear statement. It came through fragments, mentions of bills stacked too high, nights spent worrying, opportunities slipping away. And then, in a moment that felt both rehearsed and desperate, the real weight of it emerged. They were drowning financially, buried beneath more than $250,000 of debt, unsure how to claw their way out. As the words settled between us, I felt something inside me fracture. It became painfully clear that they hadn't come seeking reconciliation. They had come seeking rescue. What they didn't know was that I had already heard pieces of their story long before this moment. Friends of friends, distant relatives, people who still thought of me even when my own daughter did not. They shared glimpses of unpaid loans, dramatic tales used to elicit sympathy, and quiet questions about the inheritance I had received. I had tried to give them the benefit of the doubt, but hearing it directly from Hannah and Evan stripped away whatever hope I had been holding. Sitting there, listening to them frame their desperation as fate rather than choice, I felt used in a way I struggled to describe. Yet, beneath the heartbreak, a strange clarity settled in. Their return had never been about love. It had been about survival. And accepting that truth was the moment everything inside me began to shift. For a long moment after their confession, I felt something rise inside me that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't fear. It was a quiet, steady surge of truth pressing upward, refusing to be swallowed anymore. I realized I couldn't keep shrinking myself to make space for the expectations of people who had stepped out of my life when I needed them most. I had spent years carrying guilt that didn't belong to me, replaying memories, wondering what I could have done differently, convincing myself that every fracture in our relationship was somehow my fault. But sitting there, listening to Hannah and Evan frame their desperation as destiny, I finally saw the shape of the burden I had been holding. I survived without them. I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I learned how to stand without leaning on fantasies of reconciliation. And in that growth, I found a strength they never expected to meet. What they also didn't know was that when I received the inheritance, I consulted an attorney. Not because I was preparing for conflict, but because life had taught me that protecting what you build is an act of self-respect. Everything was secured long before they ever appeared at my door. Their assumptions about access had never been grounded in reality. As I let this truth settle in me, something shifted in the room. I watched their expressions falter, just slightly, as if they sensed the ground beneath them was no longer familiar. The woman they remembered, the one who apologized first, who bent, who carried every emotional weight, was gone. In her place was someone calm, grounded, and unwilling to be used as a rescue rope. Inside myself, I drew a clear boundary, one that echoed through every corner of my heart. I wasn't here to save them with money. I wasn't here to reopen old wounds. I was here to stand firmly in the person I had become. And in that moment, I knew the next steps would define everything that came after. When the conversation finally dissolved into silence, Hannah and Evan gathered their things without saying much. There was no dramatic exit, no raised voices, just a heavy quiet that seemed to cling to every movement they made. I watched them walk down the front steps, their shoulders weighed down by disappointment and whatever unspoken emotions they didn't know how to name. When the door clicked shut behind them, the house felt strangely still, as though it had been holding its breath the entire time. I stood there for a long while, letting the quiet settle around me. A mix of sorrow and relief moved through me in slow waves. Part of me grieved the version of us I had once hoped to restore, while another part finally felt free from the pressure of carrying that hope alone. Even in the sadness, there was clarity. For the first time, I could see the difference between abandoning someone and protecting myself. Days turned into weeks, and life gradually eased back into its rhythm. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived. It was brief, written in a tone that felt unfamiliar but honest. They had enrolled in a debt recovery program, finally taking steps to face the reality they had been avoiding for so long. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was movement, and that mattered more than I expected. As I sat with the letter, I realized that offering them resources instead of money had been an act of care, not rejection. I had given them a path forward without sacrificing my own stability or self-worth. For years, I believed love meant giving until there was nothing left of me. But now, I understood love could also look like boundaries, honesty, and letting others carry the weight of their own choices. That realization opened something gentle inside me, a quiet space where acceptance and hope could coexist. And it was from that place that I began to understand the deeper lesson this journey was leading me toward. Looking back on everything that unfolded, I understand now that this journey was never just about Hannah returning or the truth behind her intentions. It was about me finally learning what it means to love without losing myself. For so many years, I believed love required sacrifice, silence, and carrying more than my share of the weight. But standing in the aftermath of all this, I see now that real love can only grow where boundaries exist. Forgiveness can be offered freely, but access to my life, my home, and my heart must be earned. I know many people carry similar stories quietly, holding both love and hurt in the same hand. If you've lived through a moment where you had to choose yourself, or where someone you care for forced you to rethink what love should look like, I want you to know you're not alone. There is nothing selfish about protecting your peace or expecting others to take responsibility for their own lives. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening to a story that still echoes in my heart. If you've ever faced a moment where love and boundaries collided, I would truly like to hear your experience. Share it in the comments. I read every one,